Hello, everyone. This is Zara Sethna, your host at Collapse Life. Today, our guest is self taught and self made. Peter Grandich is a man of finance and a man of faith, and we're going to talk about both of those things today. He's the author of Confessions of a Former Wall Street Whiz Kid, and he's also written several booklets on finance, including one called Kids and Cash: What Every Parent Needs to Know to Raise a Financially Healthy Child. He no longer wishes to be part of what he calls the "don't worry, be happy" crowd on Wall Street. He's the founder of Peter Grandich and Company, and he has 40 years of experience with bull markets, bear markets, and everything in between. And he's here to talk about all of that with us today. So, Peter Grandich, very warm welcome to Collapse Life. It's an honor to have you with us.
Well, it's an honor to be speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So, I wanted to get started just with this "don't worry, be happy" philosophy. So, can you explain a little bit about what that is and why you wouldn't want to be associated with it?
Well, it's my opinion, and I don't throw everybody in this, but I include a vast majority of people in the financial service industry that if they were tossed off the top of the Empire State Building, they would all say the same thing all the way down. Hey, so far, so good. There's a tremendous built in bias to be cup always half full in the financial service industry. And for a lot of years, that worked because for a lot of years, the markets were a pretty good place to be. But because of what I felt a few years ago, what America entered into, I believe that philosophy will end up hurting a lot of more people than helping it. So I kind of coined the "don't worry, be happy" crowd because, even as you and I are speaking, we just had a terrible thing happen in the Middle East, and they actually spun it to that it was actually a positive thing because somehow interest rates will go lower now because the Fed can't raise rates. Yet a horrific situation that can still get a lot worse before it can get better happens, and that's just one of their trademarks that I don't wish to be associated with.
Got it. Um, we mentioned at the top that you had written a book about teaching kids about money. And one of the things you say in that is if we don't learn about money when we're young, we're going to pay a price for that for the rest of our lives. And actually, many people, including myself, were never really taught how to be financially successful. So I wanted to just kind of start there and see, what do you recommend on that front? How do you build financial literacy?
Well, I think you have to teach children from a very early age now, even a lot earlier than when I was a young person, because so much sophistication is expected on children now than it was a generation or two generations ago. So you can't hide it. You have to teach it from day one. You also have to teach it that it's something you earn. You just don't expect someone to give it to you. And my father taught me when I asked him for an allowance, he brought me down to a local gas station. He said, "Welcome to your allowance." He got me a job. And I believe that paid dividends because I learned to work from an early age and not expect somebody else to take care of things for me. So I think that's one of the principal things to do. I also think that even if they're just getting to starting school, kindergarten, first grade, that you start to show them, and if you are going to give an allowance, have chores be done for it, have it be saved, and then show them that they can earn something if they hold on to that savings by giving them a small interest rate without having to do anything. And that's another thing that I like to see parents do as well.
It seems like without general financial literacy, it could be easier for that "don't worry, be happy" crowd to manipulate the public, or to give them messaging that may not be completely accurate because they're pretty sure people won't really understand what's going on. So, would you kind of expand on that a little?
Well, I happen to fully agree with you, so I don't know your questions ahead of time. I agree with you 100%. But it's not that just in that industry as well. It's done in the car industry and other places where people get dominated because of a lack of understanding. And Wall Street learned a long time ago how to polish themselves by making them look like they may be very smart, fancy offices, big words, high degrees hanging on the wall. My degree was earned uh, working, not going to some class or something, and I wouldn't exchange that for anything. So you're right, and then there is a lack of education. And like I said, when the markets were pretty one way, which they were for quite a long period of time, that didn't show up, but now it has. And unfortunately, a lot of people made assumptions that advisors were maybe smarter than they really are. And these are, by the way, these are facts. What I'm about to state to you, Nobel laureates not hired by financial service firms but independents have done studies, and they found that 80% of money managers underperform an index fund, which simply means if you put your money in an index fund, 8 out of 10 times you'll be better off. I can't imagine if there were 8 out of 10 times a lawyer or a doctor wouldn't work out well, would people chance going to them? Yet many people are still using those advisors. So you're right, what you originally stated, and when it's good times and everything is rising, it works out. But a lot of people in the last year or two have come to learn that as a hard lesson.
Right. And when you're learning that hard lesson, you realize I need to know more. I need to understand this better. Are there some resources that you would recommend where people can go and kind of increase their literacy?
Well, first of all, I need to disclose I could be speaking to you as easily about how to lose money as to make money. So I don't want any, and the reason my book is called The Former Wall Street Whiz Kid, because after I lost several large amounts of money, not once but twice, I don't think I should be called the Whiz Kid, even though that was the moniker I was given when I worked on Wall Street. But having said that, I've also found in the last 20 years or half of my career, I became dependent in a way that a lot of people aren't. Uh, to me, the Bible became an extremely important source on how I should approach all matters, including financial matters. And I still believe people, even if they want to look at it just as an historical book and not look at it from a religious standpoint, could be quite useful. And what's interesting, the author or authors, whoever people may want to believe or not believe who they were, they've talked more about things related to matters of finance than they even do about heaven or hell, which most people would expect would be the big part of the book. So I found it to be an extremely useful way and incorporated and wear it on my sleeve to both positive and my detriment, because there are people that want no part of anybody or anything that's related to that. But for me, it's worked out quite well.
I've heard you talk about that before, and I think it's really fascinating. Can you give some examples of the kinds of lessons that you've drawn from the Bible?
Well, the first interesting thing, at a time when America is in a deep economical problem, our debt has become beyond mind boggling and getting to the point where we may have trouble servicing just the interest. There's not a positive verse in that book about debt. There's tremendous amount of different warnings about it. And so something that managed to be around for a couple of thousand years and be read by billions of people were pretty accurate about what debt problems can be caused. The other thing that's as challenging for people is there's a scripture that talks about God loves a cheerful giver, and I found that both when my giving, and not just because I was making money, but even in the tough times, and my tithing, when that increased, just seemed things worked out better. It wasn't always a monetary issue, but there was also a sense of good feeling and happiness, where people have unfortunately tied making more money is the only way to get happier. That's not necessarily the case. And I must add that some of the happiest people I met were not the superstar athletes I dealt with that made tens of millions of dollars a year, but people just working for a simple income. And they had more true happiness than I ever saw in the people of real wealth.
Yeah. I know debt to you, I think I've heard you say it's one of the dirtiest four-letter words, and it's something that you hammer home all the time. Um, I think you've said most people in America certainly are living well beyond their means, two or three times beyond their means. How do you help people understand what that means for their future? How can we change that mindset? It's something that people don't really want to hear.
Yeah, you answered it right there at the end. They don't want to hear it. Trust me, most people leave and go down to the person so-called neck down the street from me, who just paints a completely happy and easy picture, when I have a model that less is more. And I learned that the hard way myself. The problem we're facing is we have first an investment community that sells more money equals more happiness. Watch any advertisement. That's basically at the end what they're saying. If you come to us, we'll help you make more so you can have those things they show you at the end of the commercial, how everybody's happy. But it's also been tied into Madison Avenue and marketing by companies and all. That simply more stuff equals more happiness. And what I like to talk about is I talk about my parents and grandparents. They never had the large dwellings that people live in now, or I have lived in the past. They certainly didn't need something now that every mile or two you'll find on a main road, and that's called public storage, where a lot of it is used by people to keep extra stuff that they don't keep in their dwelling. So all this extra stuff and extra things, yet all medical psychiatric studies say we're more of a mess now than our parents or grandparents ever were. So more stuff doesn't equal more happiness, even though society would want you to think that the guy that owns the bus company will always be happier than the guy driving the bus. But in the real world, that's not true.
So, are there things that people can do other than just sort of saying, all right, I need to stop buying things? I mean, are there sort of steps, practical things that people can do that you would recommend?
Well, you first have to believe that you don't have to keep up with the Joneses. We live in a society, our children start. One of the things I was happy with when my daughter went to Catholic school, one of the things that eliminated is she wasn't competing her clothing to look like all the other kids. And $400 sneakers came out and everybody had to have it. It really has to start with the next generation. I think some generation is too far gone now. But I also think what people are realizing now as they get older, we didn't talk about, but we have two really huge problems in America. One's a debt crisis, the other is a retirement crisis. And people of elder age are coming to the point where they thought that they can retire, but they really can't, or they did retire, or it's becoming much more difficult to stay retired. And so people are learning that smaller dwellings, a car that don't care so much what it looks like or the nameplate on it, but if it gets me to point A or B, some of those things. But one thing you find out talking to people that once heavily were in debt and lessen it or actually eliminate it, they talk about a sense of freedom or a sense of burden that's off their shoulders. And they say it's priceless. And you really can't feel that until you do it.
Correct. You've already mentioned, we're 5 days, 1 week into a war in the Middle East and how that's going to have a huge impact. And what you've been talking about, the retirement crisis, the debt crisis, is something you've been talking about for a while now. But what are we looking at right now today, October of 2023? What is your kind of forecast, short, medium term?
So in 2021, I made a decision that America had entered its worst ever social, political, and economic era. And because of that, general equities was something that I felt most people who had too much of need to have a lot less. And for me, it meant zero. I also felt that the day of low to near zero interest rates was over and that we were going to see a dramatic rise, and therefore even bonds, which normally are this much safer of the two, offer could have also have substantial losses. We had a very bad year in 2022. Some people did the right thing, some others stayed through, and then in 2023, at the beginning, I said there probably is going to be a rally because, like I said, there's a whole industry built on seeing everything, cup half full or three quarters full. And but don't be dismayed that after 6 or so months, that'll come to an end because we've dramatically changed now in America. We have two huge problems economically. The first is the debt crisis. It's unheard of, Sarah, for me to think that here 40 years that I am speaking about multi-trillion-dollar deficits, not debt, just a yearly deficit. A business could not survive the way the government has. We now have $33 trillion in debt, and we're literally seeing as much as $10 billion a day now being added to the debt level. It's unsustainable. We have a thing called the Congressional Budget Office. It's probably the only thing that's still semi bipartisan. It has come out with a study earlier this year that says at the rate we're growing, in less than 10 years, we're going to be at $50 trillion. And now they've cut it down to 8 years because of how much more we added on debt this year. If we get to 50 trillion and if interest rates are just 5%, which is not unheard of for those of us that have gray hair. People that are very young think interest rates are always at 0 or 1%. They're not. But just a 5% interest rate on that 50 trillion would mean $2.5 trillion in interest expense. The best year we ever had as a government was last year. We took in a little over 5 trillion. So half of all that income would go just to pay interest. It's unsustainable. We couldn't run the country in any way, shape, or form that we run it now. And 8 to 10 years isn't that far off. It's not something that you can just say, oh, I'll be carefree for the next 3 or 5, then I'll start to worry about it. And on top of that, not as severe, but severe enough, is we have a retirement crisis. 65% of Americans are working paycheck to paycheck. They will be unable to reach those nice commercials you see from the financial service firms and live that happily after life. But with it comes a lot of extra burdens. I myself am in the senior community. I'm watching people when I moved in 15 years ago who were okay then are having a much more difficult time living. Some have passed already. It's gotten so tough that now polls show that seniors 65 and over are more concerned about running out of money than passing away. And so I think just those two problems from an economic standpoint, let alone the political problem we have with two parties that can't even see each other now, have serious fighting within themselves. And then we have a whole social climate environment that's totally different than what I grew up in and what our parents and grandparents grew up in. And it's very, very challenging, especially for people that came from that other era, to imagine that social ways of relativism and wokeness has come a way of life. And it's very hard for a senior community to deal with that. And I don't think it can be sustainable. So there's a whole lot of things that just are so difficult that I can't imagine an easy way out.
Is there a way out at all? I mean, we here at Collapse Life, we look at the nexus of all of those things that you just described, and our whole goal is to try and help people understand what's happening in our society, and that a certain way of life is over, certainly ending, if not over already, and what comes next. So, is there a way out? What do you see happening?
Well, I have to put my faith sleeve on and say that because my hope is not just for here, but for something that will happen after this human life ends for me, I don't get as caught up as I understand people who don't have that or agnostic or atheists. If this is all it, then I'd be even far more worried or concerned than I am at the moment. Uh, Many times things have to get to such an extreme before there's any change. You know, besides this terrible incident that's happening now in the Middle East, the continuation in Ukraine, the potential in China, and all, there's also something happening around the world that I'd be remiss if I didn't bring to attention to your readers. And that is, they've heard this word in the news, whether they're in the markets or not. They heard something called the BRIC nations, BRICS. And that's the formation of several countries, which is now doubling and tripling in size, that are forming together to not only trade away from the United States and just trade among themselves, but not to use our currency, which is currently the world reserve currency, the US dollar. That has ramifications that the don't worry, be happy crowd, even if they fully understand it, which I don't think they care to, would be alarmed. And when you take all those things into consideration, I just feel that we lived beyond our means for a lot of years. It's just like myself, who's put on more weight than should be on. And as the doctor says, I'll be much better off if I take it off. But saying it and doing it is two different things. And that's why I think it's going to be a big challenge for our society to get through this. It's not going to be an easy walk.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on top of that, we have a whole generation of young people who have been fed the line that capitalism is a failed experiment, and it's a system that they want to bring down. Is that, in your view, even remotely accurate? Is there a way to kind of undo that cynicism for that generation who's coming up?
I had that brought up to me not too long ago to a group that I was speaking to. And I asked them to please show me where anywhere in history where socialism, communism, or anything different than capitalism worked better. And of course, they can't. And then I remind them that, just so you know, the capitalism society that you don't like got you where you are today, got you the car that I know a lot of you came in the car, the nice clothes you're wearing, and so forth and so on. So it's nice. And of course, when we're younger, we have more unrealistic ideas than when we get older and all. But you're right. And if I may, and I hate to be just keep a bearer of big bad news, but that's another issue that that I'm concerned about the social end, that we're going to have somewhat of a war, and I don't mean physically, but we're going to have a war of the ages where we're going to see younger people say that, hey, I'm being so burdened with taxes to help people in 80, 85 that are Medicare is paying hundreds of thousands to have these new lungs and all this stuff. And I can't even buy food on my table. And then that older person is going to say, well, I worked all these years. You said if you took out all this money out of my money, I would be able to do this. And, that is coming. We've seen it in other countries already. Canada, which is nearby and not probably one of the closest countries similar to us, is having a very significant problem that including encouraging older people who are really in a bad way, either health wise or financial, to consider taking their own life, which is just, it's absurd for me, but it is happening. And so I think that the young people that think, well, capitalism's got to go and we got to find, some form of socialism or communism, never worked before. No reason for it to work in the future.
Right. I totally agree with you, but I do hear it all the time, and it is a concern. And you've already brought this up, but I did want to ask you again, like this in previous generations, there's been a little bit more of a dialogue between older and younger people, and maybe younger people learning from their parents and grandparents. And it feels now like we've become very polarized generationally, socially. There's just huge divides amongst people. What's your view on that? And again, can that be bridged? I know we're painting a pretty bleak picture here of the problems, and I'm kind of hoping that maybe there's some glimmer of solutions somewhere.
Well, I mentioned relativism, and before we had relativism, we were a country that basically built its business, its legal, its schooling, all on an absolute truth principle. And that has been removed over the last 20, 30 years out of that. And that's why you have this array of people who, you know, have different opinions and feel that 1% group can tell a 99% group how they have to accept something because the 1% group says so. And I think that's one of the big changes and one of the hardest things for people of my age group to accept, because we didn't work that way. We had middle ground. And listen, uh, one of the biggest concerns politically I have is it's clear and evident that the two parties cannot work together in any meaningful way. You talk to small business owners, which is still a good part of my business all around the country, and they'll tell you not only in the last 20 years has it been difficult to run a business because of all the decisions that have been made that have impacted them politically, economically, even before the pandemic, but to work with uh, government, it has been near impossible. And so there's just, I wish I could be, let me just put it this way. This type of discussion doesn't generate additional new business if I was doing it for that reason. Most people, what you and I just spoke about, rather not hear it. Or you get what I hear a lot is, hey, Mr. Grandich, I know you're right, but I'm praying you're wrong.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I just wanted to ask, going back to the Bible, you talked about debt. Are there other important lessons that you draw from the Bible right now, just with regard to the social situation we're in, or the divide between generations? Are there other things that you pull out from the book that you think are important for us to be
Well,
reflecting
I'll tell
on?
you a real life example. My best friend ever, who became a Catholic evangelist for 25 years, passed away in 2022. And I didn't realize how hurt I was by it until I had my own battle with depression last year. Uh, but in it, and what he would always strive for was acts of forgiveness. So have had an in and out relationship with my sister, who's 7 years older than me, to the point where we had not spoken for the last few years. And before my friend passed away, he would always sit down, and the first thing he'd say, Bill, I don't want to hear about my sister. I don't. And when I went into the swoon, when I went back to reading scripture daily, attending mass daily, I got this feeling that one of the things I had to do was not just with my sister, but to amends anybody that either I hurt or I felt they hurt me, which I did, including my sister. And in the last 9 months, I've had more joy and more feelings of love and satisfaction of family than I can remember in my entire life. And so, one lesson I think that I've learned recently, and the Bible teaches, and really I think is the main part of the second part of the book, that not only to come to teach about love and mercy, but about forgiveness. And I think there's too many people. It's an amazing how many families with families and brothers and sisters and don't talk to mothers and fathers and all. And I would just tell people, find a reason to bury that. It's a bondage. And it is true when they say forgiveness is not really for the person you're forgiving, it's for you. I feel so much better after I do it. Even if some of the people that said, Peter, I'm okay with that, really didn't. I'm just good that I cleared it off my mind. I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned in my life, the act of forgiveness.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's such an important lesson. And it's a hard one. I think if we want people to forgive us, then we also have to find it within us to forgive others. But it's sometimes easier said than done,
Easier said than done, correct.
for sure. So, just to summarize, I mean, so many important things that you talked about. I guess what I've heard is, simplify and stop seeking happiness in more material goods. Seek gratitude, seek forgiveness in your heart. Are there other things, pieces of advice that you would want to leave our listeners with today? Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd want to say?
So I worked for 20 years with professional athletes, and one of the things I remember seeing was a young man come in. He might have signed for the minimum, which was only 600,000, while the next guy next to him was getting 20 million or 30 million, and he had a sense of poorness, so he didn't have a sense of happiness. And when I explained to him from a material standpoint where he stood in the world about income, I think one of the things that you have to realize that if you're blessed and you have the ability not just to pay for your food and pay for your dwelling, but have excess, I think you need to share that. I think I have found that the more I got involved in giving, and giving always doesn't have to be in money. There's a lot of sweat equity that people can do that they don't do. They can give their time and service to other places. The joys that have come from that are far greater than anything that something I had money for that I could buy or experience. And from what I understand, some of the happiest people I've truly happy people I ever met, they are people that just automatically give their time and their effort. They're not concerned about what's coming back to them. And it took me a while to get that way, especially when you work in an industry and around people who are not that way, who are thinking only about how much more can I make and how much better can I do for myself. So I think that's probably one of the best lessons I learned in the 40 years in and around the financial arena.
Hmm. And in those 40 years, I know I said I was about to close, but I have more to add, to talk to you about. In those 40 years, you've seen it all, really. You've seen tons of volatility. Would you say that you've seen patterns like today before, or are we really in unprecedented times?
Well, I'll tell you what's different, Sana. First of all, the stock market, for what I knew at what existed, it's a dinosaur. If you watch one of those financial networks where they still show you sitting there, that might as well be in a museum. Markets don't operate in the reasons that they used to. When I first entered, 90% of the trading volume in the stock market was individuals, and that was individuals buying part ownerships and selling them in companies. Over half the money that's in the markets now trade based on computer driven programs that have really nothing to do with the fundamentals that we used to think were why you should own or not own a particular company. They're mathematical equations. They may involve algorithms based on trading patterns and things, but they're not because they think that soap company is going to sell more soap or make more gadgets and all. And so those of us who were gray hair and no hair, who grew up in that old market, got to understand that it doesn't exist anymore. And those that are just in it now need to realize that when you see that half the other money is in passive funds, they're not being actively managed. They're being trying to follow indexes and all in that regard. Very few people are actually buying stocks for the reasons that markets started to be what they were places to buy part ownerships of businesses. I think that's a real critical change. I think the other thing that's become is we become too short-sighted in this. When I entered the business, the typical research report had a 3 to 5 year outlook. Boy, you tell somebody it may take 3 to 5 years to even double your money, they'll look at you and go, What? I expect to do that in 3 to 5 weeks, maybe no more than 3 to 5 months. Now, the last year might have calmed that down a little, but that's still how people are, especially the younger they are. I also think that some things now people have gotten way overboard on. I'm going to be called an old fogey, and I was called a lot worse a year ago than an old fogey. But things like cryptocurrency, where already there's been $1 trillion lost, and people have lost all sorts of money in that place. And yet, the younger they are, the more absolute certain is this is the next greatest thing. It's better than the wheel being invented and all that. One thing I can say is when anything comes out like that, and people are expressing that as they still are now, can't miss. It's going to $1 million and all. I can tell you after 40 years, I've never seen anything, and there's been similar things like that work out unless you're in very early. It's like a Ponzi scheme. If you don't get in a Ponzi scheme early, you're set to lose. And some of these things have become that now.
Yeah. So if you are lucky enough to have some money set aside for retirement, are there good things? I know you don't want to give investment advice, and that's fair, but are there areas where people can make investments at this point to try and kind of
Well,
preserve
I
what
tell
they
you what,
have?
some things I can tell you. I always tell people when I sit down and we look, and they have 19% credit cards that they're paying debt on. And they ask me, what stocks can I invest in? I said, your credit cards. And they look at me, what do you mean my credit cards? Well, if you pay that off, that's like making 19%. And then I explained to them really how it's compounding and how much more they're going to pay. Also with mortgages. Now, of course, now if you were fortunate to finance down at 2 or 3%, doesn't get wise because you're going to, if you have to get money again, it's going to cost you a lot more. So the first thing is, the second thing is I learned is it's better to be a live chicken than a dead duck. I can't tell you how many people I've seen that were once the rave of everybody, or they had the greatest book or whatever, and they're long gone. And most of the money they made was selling their advice, not acting on their advice, but selling their advice that's supposed to work. There are no systems or any of that nature. And I just go back to something we touched on earlier. Get your own house in order. Get it, if you could pay off and somehow not have debt, not have a mortgage, not have to have $4,000 worth of leases sitting outside where you can just have a couple of cars and get you to and from the place. As much as you think that's not going to bring you joy, not having that financial pressure on you is just an enormous relief that automatically leads to more happiness, in my opinion, anyway.
Great. So there is cause for for optimism then.
Oh yeah, listen. One thing that I can tell you, that old saying, "Adversity creates opportunity." It definitely does. There's still going to be certain needs that people are going to have. People are still going to try to live in all. It's just going to become a lot more challenging, and it's going to be a lot more taken. Uh, I use a talk about the wagon pull, and I think it's important people know about it. And I'm not the originator of this. It was a gentleman that came out a couple president races ago that used it, but he brought up a good term. About 10 or 15, up to 10 or 15% of Americans need help. We have to have social programs to help people who have had a tough time. They shouldn't be forever because then people get used to that. But the problem is that the governments were punishing the people who were still pulling. They weren't thanking them for being pullers. As more and more people are getting in that wagon and less people are pulling, those of us that remain pulling, they're demeaning us. They're like, you should be, pull more, give it. And the government can't even keep its own house in order. So I do think that less is more, which is my motto, is the appropriate model.
Hmm.
And our parents and grandparents, many of them, my parents never had a credit card. They had a small apartment and everything, but I think they managed two good kids. I know two kids that are talking again to each other, which is a good thing. But I just think that happiness can be found in the simplest things. And the more simple we make our life and take away the burdens of worry about finance and stuff, I think happiness comes with that.
I think that's a beautiful message, and it's a great place to end on. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the show, and I really hope you'll come back and join us for another discussion. But before we go, can you tell people how they can find you and how they can learn more about what you do?
Sure. Well, petergrandich.com is our website. I do have a YouTube channel. There I post interviews like this that where people interview me, as well as a few that I do. But I spent a lot of time, and I can't call it X. I got to call it Twitter. I found myself on Twitter. It's a wonderful way for me to communicate to everybody all at once, instantaneously. When I used to think I used to put out a newsletter where we typeset it for 2 days, went to the printer, folded it, mailed it for another 2 to 3 days, and now just a mere seconds you can say and do the same things. So I have a Twitter page as well.
Yeah, and I have to say, Peter runs an amazing GIF game. You are so good at picking out the right GIF for the right moment.
Well, thank you very much. This was I the one of the things that I love doing, what you've given me this opportunity today, is share what has transpired. I think if we were more upfront in the financial service industry, we would actually do more business and not put on all these acts and speak and watch these people on television claiming they're ringing bells and they know what they're doing when a lot of them really don't. So thank you for that opportunity to share that.
Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. So, if you liked what you heard and saw today, please follow us on Twitter as well at collapse_life. I won't call it X either. And like, share, comment, subscribe to this video as well. That's really going to help us expand our reach and bring more guests on like Peter. We're also on Substack. We publish news stories every week, collapselife.substack.com, and on the web at collapselife.com. We do everything we do because of your support. So we're really grateful for all your subscriptions, for following us on these channels, and for just being part of this journey with us. We've dubbed Collapse Life the thinking person's guide to society and demise. It's about opening eyes, taking control, taking action in our lives, really understanding what's happening and plotting a way forward. And so we're really grateful to people like Peter for coming on and helping us understand that. And we look forward to bringing you more voices like Peter's. So we can't wait to see you next time. Until then, just remember to keep your chin up. It's only collapse. See you soon.